Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Ginny Van Duzen, Director of Alumni Career Development at Holy Cross, and I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar, How to Land a Corporate Board Seat. This is the next installment in our series of web-based presentations covering a broad range of career development topics. Today, I'm very happy to welcome Mike Jeanes from the class of 1970. Mike is an experienced CEO, board director, and executive coach who works with people interested in becoming members of corporate boards. We'll be together for a little under an hour today. Mike will speak and will then take questions from you for as long as time allows. I encourage you to submit questions throughout this presentation by checking out the question function located on your webinar toolbar to the right. Thank you again for joining us, and now it's my pleasure to turn things over to Mike.
Thank you, Ginny. It's a real treat to be here. I always love talking to Holy Cross alums and students. So what I'm going to try to do is to cover a lot of ground today in a practical way that will allow you to land a corporate board seat. We find that more and more people are interested in corporate board work, and I'm a big fan of corporate board work for the right situation. And I'll explain what I mean by that as we go along. Some of my comments will also refer to nonprofit boards as well, which many of the same duties and some of the same processes to get on a nonprofit board are similar to what we do for a corporate board. So as Ginny said, I've been on a range of corporate boards and nonprofit boards. I was the CEO of a startup.com company some years ago, and as a result of that position, sat on the board. This was a pre-IPO company. In contrast to that, I'm also on the board now of Amica Mutual Insurance Company, a $2 billion mutual insurer of auto, home, and life. And I chair the audit committee there, and I previously chaired the compensation committee. Along the way, I've also been on the boards of a small photographic college in Maine. I'm currently on the board of the Boy Scout Council in Boston and of the Boys and Girls Club in Nashua, New Hampshire. I previously was president of the board of that Boy Scout Council, as well as president of the board of Habitat for Humanity in Massachusetts. So I will speak from that type of experience. So let's get started. This is an ad that it's really a fanciful ad. You will never see this in any newspaper because that is not how board seats get filled. They're not filled that way. People are still truly invited to join a board. And to get invited, you kind of need to know some of the nuances of how to get that invitation. So let me start at a very fundamental level in terms of making sure that we all understand what boards are responsible for. And this is true regardless of what kind of board we're talking about. And so I think of it in three buckets. Boards are responsible for oversight of management, and that is not the same thing as managing management. And it's certainly not the same thing as micromanaging management. Management is tasked with running the organization. The board is tasked with oversight of management, and two, managing the CEO succession, which basically means that you hire and fire the CEO, and you need to make sure that you have the right CEO in place for whatever stage of life that company is in. And then third, boards are strategic sounding boards. Typically, boards don't write the strategy for a company, but they are responsible for asking the right questions to make sure that the strategy is the correct one for the organization. Now, I say typically simply because when you work in a smaller organization, picture a startup tech company, the line gets blurred a little bit, and you may be asked to roll up your sleeves and help actually write the strategy. So I say here in the box that boards are mentors, monitors, and decision makers. Most people get the first two, but decision makers is the thing I want to emphasize. Boards are not tasked with simply sitting around listening to a management presentation and nodding their heads. They're charged to make decisions. And with that decision comes some legal obligations. And I don't want to get too technical about this, but the duty of care, which basically means that you exercise the right amount of care and diligence in your role. The duty of loyalty, which means you put the best interests of the whole company first and foremost, are the two duties that if you conform to those, if there should be some kind of a legal action, you're well protected. And then the business judgment rule is interesting. It basically says that if you stick to your duty of care and loyalty and make a decision, even if that decision is wrong, you're not held liable. So you're not asked to be infallible as a board, but you're asked to go through a process that does that. So what kind of people are the ones that are attractive for boards? Well, first, it's people who can provide advice and have perspective. Now, I know some people who are very willing to provide advice, but they've got absolutely no perspective at all. So you need both of those to be a good director. But boards look for more than simply that. They look for people who have a record of leadership in their field, who have certain skills that the board may be looking for at that particular time, that are comfortable around financials. They want diversity. And here people tend to think today about ethnic and gender diversity. That is a big part of it, but not the only part of it. They're looking for diversity of perspective, diversity of age, diversity of background. Having a bunch of people sitting around the board that all came from the same school or same background is a recipe for failure. And finally, boards often look for directors who have been through the same issues that company is now facing. So as an example, if you're in the board of a company that's expanding internationally, and you in fact have done that in your professional life, that can be quite attractive for that board. And so I'm drilling down just a little bit deeper in terms of what boards are looking for. And here's a laundry list, and I'm not going to read through them, but you have to figure out yourself which things you bring to the board. And I'm going to suggest an exercise a little bit later to help you to get a hold of that. Spencer Stewart does an annual governance survey, and this is, they ask directors who would they like to see as their next director on the board. And you can see at the very top of the list are active CEOs and women and people with financial experience. That's the wish list. Now I want to tell you that that is not the way it turns out in reality, and I'll show you some data to show that. So let me just get us centered on the different types of boards. And so the title of this session is How to Get on a Corporate Board, and that's not enough to simply say I want to sit on a corporate board. Do you want large or small? Do you want public or private? You know, what type of company would be in your sweet spot? That's a critical question to ask. There's also mutual fund boards, which I'm not going to talk about a lot today, but they have many of the same characteristics of corporate boards, and you don't need to be an investment professional to be on a mutual fund board. Then there are nonprofit boards, and here you have to make some decisions about what floats your boat, whether it's arts or social services or education, whether you want to work on a local basis or you want to work for Habitat for Humanity International, as an example. And then there are advisory boards. Advisory boards are lighter lifting than corporate boards, and basically they don't have fiduciary responsibility, but they are charged with doing certain things that are laid out in their particular charter. And you know, one place where you see a lot of advisory boards are in family-owned companies. And in that case, if you can picture a company that's 90% owned by an individual, you may be asked to be on the board of directors, but make no mistake, you are on the board of advisors for that company, because the 90% shareholder is the one making the decisions. So when you have a conversation with someone about sitting on a board, it's important to get a sense of what are the issues that tend to populate boardroom conversation these days. And the most prominent one is linking company performance to executive comp. Executives get paid only when they produce results. Another issue is the board's role in corporate strategy, and that is linked very closely with the board's role in overseeing risk. Strategy and risk go hand in hand, and the board has a very important role in that. And good boards spend more and more airtime in the boardroom with talking about strategy and risk. Boards worry about the CEO situation. Do they have the right CEO now? And more importantly, do they have the right CEO for the future? Not only the planned succession, but also the accidental succession, where the CEO is hit by the proverbial bus. And that's taking up a lot of time in boardroom discussions today. And then finally, building internal talent and leadership is an important thing that boards pay attention to. I bring this up only because when you're having conversations with folks about joining a board, for you to understand a bit about what the conversation is like in the boardroom makes you that much more an attractive candidate. When boards look for new directors today, they typically do a SWOT analysis or a skills matrix. And I don't expect you to read this whole chart, but the idea is basically the current board members are listed across the top. Down the left-hand side, you can see the various skill areas that they have, and then you can look at the blanks where they don't have talent. And that tends to be how they look for new directors to fill in those blanks. And so you may be a perfect candidate to fill in those blanks for a company, but another company that looks like the same company as the first one may have no interest in you because they don't have the same blanks, because their director skills set is somewhat different. So knowing what that is an important thing, and knowing how your skills can resonate with them is important. I'll talk about that in a couple of minutes. So I'm going to go through a few pages of data, about 3 pages, to give you a sense of how boards have changed. Now, if you look at the bottom of this, this is from a universe of S&P 500 companies, so it is by far not the total universe. But I found that the direction that these trends indicate are true whether we're talking about a small startup company or a large S&P 500 company. So you can see things here comparing what's happened in the last decade. Just look at the arrows now. That there are fewer situations where the CEO and the chair are the same person. 10 years ago, 2/3 of the time, the CEO was also the chair. Today, it's only about half. The other thing is CEOs serve on fewer outside boards today. Often companies are saying to their CEO, look, we don't want you to serve on any outside board because it's too complicated running the company that you're running now. We don't want you distracted. Or they may say, you can sit on 1 outside board, but not 2. So what that does is it opens up a lot of opportunity for folks who either are below the CEO level or who are retired CEOs. The other 3 arrows are interesting in terms of mandatory retirement age. For corporate board work in this country, there tend not to be term limits, but rather mandatory retirement ages. It's different in Europe, and it's certainly different in nonprofit boards where there are term limits. But mandatory retirement ages are a way to kind of, it's a bit of a blunt instrument to clear out some of the dead wood. But you can see here that the trend, particularly for older directors, is very, very pronounced. A decade ago, 9% of directors, of boards had a retirement age of 75. And today, it's like 39%. That's a huge change. People are living longer, healthier lives. Executives and other individuals really enjoy board work. And it's also found that boards require more of your time, and as a result of that, they like people who are, quote, retired. I hate that word retired, but I'll talk about it more in a minute. And the last thing here is declassified boards, which basically means that for these S&P 500 companies, virtually all of them have directors on 1-year terms, and they all stand for election every year. Now, this is what new independent directors look like among these S&P 500 companies. Their average age is about 57. 1/3 of them are women. That's the highest it's ever been. And a third of these people are first-time directors, which I think is very good news. If many of you on the call today are looking for your first board seat, this should give you a great deal of encouragement that there's some fresh thinking and board refreshment going on. 15% are ethnic minorities. So this is the diversity comment that I made earlier. Here's another look at new independent directors. And you can see that the percent of active CEOs and presidents is down significantly over the last 10 years for the reason I mentioned earlier. Retired CEOs are up. Division presidents are up. And people with financial backgrounds continue to always be in demand, whether that is your functional expertise and therefore could be on an audit committee. But if not that, they expect people who have a good working knowledge of financial statements. And so here's, I think, which is a pretty interesting thing. Last year, almost half of new independent directors were retired. And look how that compares to just 16% back in 2012. People want directors who have time to devote to director work in a serious way. And I'll talk to you about what that time means in just a moment. One of the things that's made the time commitment greater is the additional involvement of our government with Sarbanes-Oxley back in 2002, followed by these other acts ending in Dodd-Frank back in 2010, which is not totally promulgated yet, and the current administration is making noises that they'll loosen up on those requirements. But the point is that's required a lot more time of directors. And so here's a way to look at the time. So the NACD, that's the National Association of Corporate Directors, does an annual study that shows the average amount of time that directors spend being a director. And it's about 5 hours a week. And that's not just showing up at the meetings. That's traveling to the meetings, preparing for the meetings, the informal conversations that you have in between, et cetera, et cetera. So the thing I want you to think about is, on average, and yes, averages are always a bit deceptive, but on average, 5 hours a week, half a day a week. So if you've got a day job, it's very difficult to think that you could manage more than one board seat in addition to doing your day job, because it's going to take you half a day a week to do that. So, so it's something to think about. Compensation is another thing that's always on people's mind when they take a board seat. So here's a quote that I dug out of the archives back 14 years ago. And this managing director of Pearl Meyer, which is a large executive compensation consulting firm, made the statement that director pay packages are going to increase a lot over the coming years. Well, she was right, and they're increasing because of these things. More responsibilities, more time is required. The perception of greater liabilities is huge. Increased shareholder pressure. There is a strong demand for independent directors. Most companies today will only have 1, 2, or possibly 3 inside directors. Inside meaning they are a member of management as well. The others are normally independent directors. And there are just fewer CEOs available. So there is competition for directors. All of those are forcing director pay higher. And so a big change, kind of a sea change, I think, is that go back just over 20 years ago, and most of director comp was in cash. 86% is in cash. And today, more than half of it is some form of equity, either full value grants or company stock options. There are two really dimensions that determine what directors get paid. First off, what industry are you in? There are frankly some industries that pay more than others, and you can see the two ends of the spectrum right here. So what industry you're in will dictate what you get paid. The other thing that dictates what you get paid is how big is the company. Oh, I apologize for this chart, but I just want to point out that this NACD director comp report divides companies into different sizes: micro, small, medium, large, and top 200. And then you can see at the bottom line, the bottom row, director comp has a direct linear relationship with the size of the company. So if you're in a micro company, defined here as $50 million to $500 million in revenue, the average is $120,000 in director comp. Now that's all in. That's cash and equity, fees and retainers, the whole thing. If you go down, if there were another column here that talked about very small or hyper micro companies that were less than $50 million, you might see a different thing. And here, companies are usually cash constrained, and they may do all or a vast majority of compensation in company stock. But you should know what directors make, not because you're going to cut your own deal. All directors get paid the same except for committee assignments and so forth. But you should know that for the simple reason that when you sign up for becoming a director, you want to determine by your own calculus whether you're getting paid correctly. I had a client a couple of years ago who was asked to join a board of a private equity-backed consumer product company. And they told him what the compensation was, and he said, you know, that seems a little low to me. And the reaction from the chairman who was extending the offer was interesting. He said, you know, you're not the first director to say that. And we promise that if you come on board, we'll do a compensation review for the directors and adjust accordingly. Well, my client joined, and they did within 6 months do the analysis, and as a result, they gave directors a substantial raise. So the point is, if you know what is acceptable, you're in a much better position when you have that discussion about what the compensation is. The NACD, if you are a member, there's a large annual compensation report that you can get that will have a lot of this information in it. Now, a quick nod to advisory boards. Okay, these are different, as I said, than boards of directors. You don't have a fiduciary responsibility. It's lighter lifting. And typically, they're either formed around a certain issue, or they are for a family-owned company. Now, when I say a certain issue, here's an example. Avon, some years ago, when they were expanding more deeply into China, formed an advisory board of women who have done business in China to understand a bit from their perspective the nuances of doing that. So that's an example of these boards. And they tend to be in place for a finite period of time, and then they disband. And yes, they are compensated. Now, here's the question that all of us need to be asking, and that is, why should you be invited to join a board? So, and there are characteristics that I mentioned earlier, advice and perspective being the headline, but there are other things, other qualities that are looked for, and I want you to see how you size up to these. Despite all the changes that I've talked about in the makeup of boards over the last decade, there are still things that boards want in directors. They want people who are high in integrity, that are strategic, and they know the market that the company is in. They are candid in giving feedback, they bring a diverse perspective, and they know how to work collaboratively to get consensus within the boardroom. And importantly, they understand that the board's role is to hold management accountable for running the company. And then finally, they're willing to devote the necessary time. I'm going to come back to this time thing a few times, and it seems a little bit obvious, I think, to some, but I want to tell you it's not obvious. As you talk to people about your interest in board work, you have to make it very clear that you've got the time to do that. So just a point about nonprofits. Boards look for something different here. You're not getting a check, you're writing a check. They're often asking you to give money, get money from others, or simply get off the board. And they also look for your time, your talent, and your treasure, nonprofit boards. When you think about nonprofit boards, I mentioned earlier, there are very different types. You need to understand what's the right nonprofit board for you. Is it an organizing board That might be a small board. It might be a totally volunteer organization, and you actually roll up your sleeves and do a lot of the work. Is it a governing board, where there tend to be more members, but it's a bit more formal, and there's a focus on good governance in guiding the organization? Typically, I would say a local Boys and Girls Club or a Boy Scout Council would be governing boards. And then there's the institutional board. And here, it's much more formal. And it's, you could think here of Oxfam International or Save the Children International, where they focus on fundraising and good governance for a very large organization. So which of those types of nonprofit boards is right for you is a question you need to ask. Now I'd like to give you some practical, I hope, advice on how to position yourself to get that invitation to join a corporate board. So there are two ways, actually. The first way is if your name is one of these people. And interestingly, Ginny told me that none of these people are on the call today. So we're just going to go back and go to the second way. And the second way takes a bit more work. So first, you've got to have skills that are relevant to their business, and you can communicate them. Now, let me pause on this. I'm on the board of a mutual insurance company, which I mentioned earlier. My background in insurance before I joined that board was that I had 2 auto policies and a homeowner's policy. That was it. I had no insurance industry background, but my background is as a consumer products marketer and general manager, and that's what they were looking for. We get plenty of people on the insurance company board who come from the insurance industry. We don't need everybody from the industry. So I brought a particular skill that was relevant to the business. You need to have a record of achievement, and that needs to be well known. Look, let me just go back to the one I just talked about a moment ago about skills relevant. You got to be able to communicate these two. And I'm going to spend some time, and one of the key strategies is, can you communicate these in a way that is compelling, that is crisp, and people want to listen to you? So that I don't want to underestimate the communication piece of this. A record of achievement. It helps if you have a relationship with people who can influence board directors, or actually with board directors who could say, gee, I'd like you to join our board. Financial acumen is important, which I mentioned earlier. And again, you could be a financial expert, as is defined through Sarbanes-Oxley and defined by the various stock exchanges. Typically, a financial expert is someone who has been responsible for compiling the financial statements of the company, or responsible for signing off on those financial statements. And that typically means a CFO, a CEO, or a partner in the public accounting firm. That's a financial expert. You don't have to be a financial expert, but you got to be very knowledgeable about financial statements. Executive presence is important. And here I'm not looking for people who are just out of central casting. I'm looking for people who have good social skills and can be effective in a group setting and making decisions. It helps if your profile is visible, that people know of your expertise as well as your willingness to sit on boards. Which brings us to the last point. Nobody will necessarily assume that you want to sit on a board unless you tell them that. That, along with telling them that you have the time, are two key things to keep in mind. People need to know that you're interested in sitting on a board. A few years ago, when I was running this company in Boston, New Directions, that works with senior executives, I was running a workshop, and one of the people in the room had run the mutual fund complex for a very large mutual fund investment firm in the Boston area. And he said at one point, you know, I've been out of blankety blank company for 6 months now, and no one's asked me to be on the board of a mutual fund. And he had run the mutual fund complex there. And so I asked what I thought was a simple question. I said, how many people have you told that you want to sit on a mutual fund board? And the answer was kind of astounding. He said, well, no, nobody, because people should just understand that. Well, first off, if you get beyond the hubris of this statement, he was clearly making a fundamental choice that nobody was going to connect the dots and think that he would want to sit on a mutual fund board unless he told them that. So now let me go into hopefully four strategies that'll help you join a board. You know, I could have 14 strategies here, but I want to distill it to things that I think will really get you off the launching pad here. The first one is being able to communicate your value, doing it in a crisp, clear, and confident way. This really becomes your personal brand. If you can communicate what value you bring to the board, that is what people are going to remember about you. And so you've got to do it, but by first starting and looking in the mirror. You know, be pretty self-aware. You know, are you really board material? And not everybody is, but if you are, then where do you bring value? What is it? And you need to be honest with yourself. And then let people know that you're interested in being a director. You need to polish up your brand, which I'm going to talk about, so that you can communicate it very succinctly. You have to rehearse the message with the idea of, this is what you're trying to say. This is how I can help this company and its board, as opposed to, this is what I want to do. I'm sure you've all heard the term elevator drill or elevator pitch. I hate it. I hate it because it tends to be me focused. It's all about what I want to do. What I'm telling you here is your message should be focused on the other party, how you can help the other party. And then as you communicate your value, you've got to have some of the soft aspects. You don't want to talk a lot. You want to show that you know your stuff and display a bit of personality. Believe it or not, people are making a judgment on you as to whether or not they would want to sit around a board table with you in meetings and work with you. So all those things are ways to communicate your value. And here specifically is a piece of homework that I would challenge you with. I'd like you to fill out or complete these 2 sentences. You should invite me to join your board because, and the type of company where I can add the most value is. Now, what I'm not, so I am strongly recommending that you can concisely complete those 2 sentences and be able to communicate it crisply. But I'm not saying that you need to use that sentence structure. But the 2 ideas here are pretty fundamental. So do that. And the second balloon about the type of company is often what people neglect. They neglect it because they just don't have a sense for the type of company that they want to be on. Now, your personal brand. You have to speak it. You have to be able to write it, and you need to have a digital presence. So the spoken part is this very short, less than a minute statement that is focused on what the board needs. And that's what you are calling your value proposition, what I would call your personal board brand. Then you need some written material. Typically it's a resume and a bio. So what I'd suggest is, I'm going to assume that most, if not all of you, have a resume. I would start by looking at the top of it. There should be a short paragraph that deals with a profile. It summarizes what people should know about you. That should be reworked or modified to focus on those things that are board relevant rather than management relevant. Now, I'm not suggesting you do a whole different resume. You may need to, but I'm not suggesting that. You can often modify a good management resume to be a good board resume. And then look down the rest of the resume, and if and make sure that your accomplishments reek of things that are relevant to the board. So here's a negative example. If you say that you're detail-oriented and a hands-on manager, and that's been the secret of your success, that's probably not something that you want to talk about because that's not what boards look for in directors. I also suggest that in addition to a resume, you do a 1-page bio. And here it's 1 page. I like it when you've got your picture on it. It warms it up. It gives it some humanity. And what it allows you to do is write in the first paragraph to promote those aspects of your background and skills that are most of interest to boards. Good to have both of those documents. You can use them for different occasions. And then finally, your digital profile. If you don't have a LinkedIn profile, you're invisible. You need to have a good LinkedIn profile. Having a bad or haphazardly thrown together LinkedIn profile is probably worse than having no profile. So you want to have your picture on it, a professional picture. This is not your Facebook picture. You want to have the message that you want the world to see out there. And so it should be, it should synchronize with what's on your resume, but it shouldn't be your resume. And finally, you should know that a lot of recruiting firms now don't even ask for resumes. They simply will say, everything I need to know about you, I will find on your LinkedIn profile. So have a LinkedIn profile. I guess I should say the obligatory, be careful about Facebook. Don't put anything in there that could hurt your professional life. Twitter, blogs, Instagram, of less importance, although, you know, if you happen to be in a high-tech space that's high on social media, you may want to do that, but I don't think you necessarily need that. You don't necessarily need a personal website unless you have something very particular that you want to convey on that. And then finally, I think a good way to get a start on what your digital profile is just Google it yourself. You may be surprised at what you see. Let's go to the second board strategy, and that's using your network. And here, it's really building awareness for starters. And even before you've told somebody about your interest in, your value proposition, you have to tell them that you're interested in board work and you have the time to do it. It helps if you target companies and industries that could be intriguing to you. And if you know directors who are on boards of companies that interest you, have a conversation with them. Research people who could be centers of influence. Typically, these are people that are not on the board that you're focused on, but they may be CEOs or directors of other companies. They may be the public accounting firm or the law firm that the company that you're targeting has an interest in. They may be investors in the company. Get to know those people. Identify them first and then connect with them. And this is a process. You need to be patient. You need to sit back and say, gee, I've done my resume and I'm going to wait for the phone call to ring about sitting on a board. It probably won't happen. So what you want to do is to use this as a process. Always look for some kind of a warm introduction. Don't call people cold. But also you'll find some people don't want to talk to you, and they make it known just by not responding to voicemails or emails. Well, give up on that. So don't stalk people either. And then finally, I would say you need to get referrals, but even better is to get an endorsement. And here's the way I would make the distinction. If I said to someone, you know, I really would like you to meet Mike Jeans. I've met him. He's a good guy. So would you do me a favor and meet Mike? Now that's great. That's not great. It's good. It's certainly better than a poke in the eye and the sharp stick. But that's a referral. So an endorsement is something like this. You need to meet Mike Jeans. He is terrific. He would be a wonderful addition to your board or some other board that you'd be proud to recommend him to. Do yourself a favor. Don't do me a favor. Do yourself a favor and meet him. That's an endorser. So if you can get people to endorse you, that's much, much stronger than a referral. Take a referral when you can, but endorsements are really gold. When you meet with people in your network, have a good ask, a bite-sized ask. Here's the ask I hate. Now that we've had this lunch together, if you hear of any board opportunities, please let me know. That is awful because it puts the burden of your board search on that other person, and chances are that when you call that person back to follow up in some weeks or months afterwards, that person has not kept you in mind because he or she is very busy with his own life, her life. And so that person may feel a bit embarrassed that he or she let you down. Ask for something instead that's bite-sized, that they can do, that they can readily do. It could be you're asking for to have a cup of coffee to get their advice. It could be that you're looking for an introduction to a particular individual that you know this person is connected with. It may be that you want information or an introduction to a company, but it's bite-sized, something that can be done. And before you talk to someone, develop in your own mind what that ask should be. What's bite-sized? So I talk about asking for AIR. It's an acronym for advice, insight, and recommendations. Those are always things that people are often flattered to do. You should be in touch with search firms. Keep in mind that you don't. Search firms are not working with you. They're working for the company that hired them to fill a position, either a director role or CEO role. The data would suggest that only the minority of times is a recruiter involved in a search for a director position, but you need to know them. What you need to do is to get beyond simply sending a resume into them and either get a face-to-face, which is perfect, or at least get a phone call so that you can get your visibility with them. Ask for someone to introduce you if you don't know these people. Ask someone to introduce you to to a recruiter who they may have hired in the past, who can be who will feel that they owe that person something and will therefore give you some airtime. If you've hired a executive recruiter in the past, use this opportunity to contact him or her. And if that person is not the one in the firm that does the board searches, ask that recruiter to introduce you to the person who is. Create a timetable. You got to be serious about this. This just doesn't happen by sitting back, as I mentioned before. And then finally, on the networking piece, I would say, let's turn this around a little bit. The old saw about who you know, it's not so much that as it is who knows you and who knows that you've got the interest, the time, and and a value that you can bring to the board. Now I'm going to go to the third strategy: increase your visibility. If you've given speeches before, if you've written articles, if you've been quoted, these are ways to increase your visibility. Do more of that stuff. You can consult. You can sell yourself as an expert. You can continue to get published or quoted or give speeches. You can serve on panels if you, for the industry that you're involved in. Typically, annual industry conferences may set their panels together a year in advance, but don't despair on that if you're not on the panel. Virtually all the time, there are people that cancel out for any variety of conflicts. Make it known to whoever's putting panels together at your industry conference that you're available to stand in should there be a cancellation. Now, the fourth strategy is one that I'm urging you to think outside of the box and do things like this. You could invest in the company. Heck, you could buy the company and that would get you on the board. Show how you can raise capital for an early stage cash-starved company. You could consult for the company or be an interim or part-time CEO. And again, companies who are going through some type of transition may very well value that. You can volunteer to serve on a nonprofit board where you can meet people who are on corporate boards. Now, I want to be careful when I say this. Never, ever join a nonprofit board with the idea that it's a stepping stone to a corporate board. If you join a nonprofit board, it's because you're taken by the cause. You really have a passion for what the organization does. That said, there are lots of examples of people who have served together in nonprofit boards, made some kind of a bond together, and one nonprofit director asks the other if he's interested in sitting on his corporate board. It happens. And then don't do this by yourself. You should make your friends and family part of your team, and they should be endorsers for you as well. So those are 4 strategies. And I started off with the most important in terms of communicating your value, and I suggest that you take that quite seriously. Now, since we're running late, I'm going to very quickly go through due diligence. Okay, I am of the belief that if you get on the wrong board, that's a bigger mistake than if the board invites you and you turn out to be the wrong person for the board. So you need to do some due diligence. You should be asking yourself 3 basic questions. Can it hurt you? That's the downside question. Is it worth doing? That is, can you make a difference? And are you going to have any fun? Are you really going to enjoy going to the board meetings? There are 3 types of risk that you need to be aware of. Financial, time, and reputation. We tend to think about financial risk. Gee, I could be sued. That's the one that's most easily mitigated through D&O insurance, directors and officers insurance. It's not trivial, but it can be easily taken care of. The risk of time is a big one. That is that if you signed up for, I'm going to make this up, 6 board meetings and 4 committee meetings a year, and it turns out to be a lot more than that, that can be a big time suck on your hands, and particularly if you have a day job, that could be difficult. And then finally, and the biggest, is the risk of reputation. I don't know, if you were on the Enron board, as an example, your reputation has been trashed and you will never get on another corporate board. Now, there's a whole bunch of questions you could ask. I'm not going to go through that today, but I am going to say that here is the most potent and revealing question when you talk to people in your networking or interviewing for a board. What can you tell me about your board? It is deceptive in its simplicity. People will take you in a lot of directions. What can you tell me about the board? They may talk about the quality of the people, the interaction with management, their concerns about the company, how strategic versus tactical they are. You can find out a lot of things. Ask that question. And when you do due diligence, I start with a funnel. You look at public information, then you can ask the company for information. You can even ask competitors for their perspective. And then when you're actually deep in discussions, in interviews with that company, don't talk to simply one director. Don't talk to just the CEO. Talk to as many people as you can on the board. Certainly the CEO, certainly the lead director, the chair of the governance committee, which is also the nominating committee, is often one. I think one of the good ones to talk to is the last director to join the company, where you can ask, gee, how'd that work out for you? Is this really what you wanted it to be? And then talk to 1 or 2 other members of management. CFO is a good one for there. If you go on the investor relations tab on a company website, you will find out a lot about the company. And so what you want to do is find out enough so that you appear intelligent and you've done some homework. And you should ask questions like this. Whoops, sorry. You should ask questions like that. I'm rushing at this point, but the key one is the top one, which is, what can you tell me about your board? So D&O insurance, we could spend an hour on this, but I'm only going to take this this slide and basically say, when you hear people talk about that, you want to focus on side A, not B or C. Side A is the coverage that directors and officers have if they're named as defendants. That's what you're interested in. And here's some things that you shouldn't ask in an interview. Don't ask questions that you could have easily found if you just did a little bit of homework. But do ask substantive questions that shown you've paid attention, you've read some materials, you care enough to do some homework on it. And for a nonprofit board, you should ask yourself these questions. Is it the right cause? And is it the right organization? If your cause, for example, is finding a cure for cancer, which is very noble, there are lots of organizations that focus in that space. So it's a 2 question. Identify the cause and identify whether the organization is right for you. And can you work with the organization during its particular stage in life? If it's an early stage, all volunteer group, or a multinational organization, or something in between. And make sure you know not only what you can contribute, but what they expect you to contribute, both from a skills standpoint and a monetary standpoint. And also ask yourself, why do I want to do this? What do I want to get out of joining the board? After you join a board, read everything. Attend meetings, all the meetings on a corporate board. You're not expected to just dip in and out like you might on a nonprofit board. Also, go to continuing education opportunities. There's the ACCD, which is the American College of Corporate Directors, also the NACD, National Association of Corporate Directors, both very good sources for work. So a few things just to wrap up. There's a lot of boards that just aren't that good, and you've got to work to get your board to be good. And so you want to get on a good board. The CEO does work for the board, and the board does not work for the CEO. Smaller boards are better. You have better communication, better conversation. Big names don't necessarily mean you're going to be a great board member. And the board does have a separate set of responsibilities from its executives. Having balance in the board is key, not only for the people who are there, but also how you spend your time, the amount of information you get, etc. I love this. It's dangerous to ask people with limited information to make decisions. Experts are valuable. Know-it-alls are dangerous. And finally, there's no substitute for experience except maybe competence. So with that said, I'm going to take some questions. Jenny?
All right, thanks, Mike. We'll kick one off here. We've gotten a couple of questions asking about training programs and if you think there's value in that.
Yes, I do. I think not only, I think continuing ed for directors is critically important, not just to get on your first board, but also once you're a director to continue to do that. And what I mentioned in one of the last slides are two groups, the American College of Corporate Directors, I think that's accdirectors.com, and the National Association of Corporate Directors, which I think it's nacdonline.org. Those are two good ones. Both of those organizations have credentialing, which is you can go through a curriculum and get certified as a professional certified director. I recommend that's a good goal for people to have. It's a demonstration that you take being a good director seriously. It is not the ticket that's going to get you onto a board, but it's useful to have. So I'm a big fan of ongoing training and continuing ed. I would also say, just as another part of that is, when you join a new board, you should make sure that the company has an orientation program for directors. You don't want to wait 4 or 5 meetings before you get the hang of it. You could be almost a year doing that. You need to get oriented, and if the company doesn't have an orientation program, you should ask for time to meet with a lot of the key players there.
All right, and how about programs that are run within companies or that are associated with specific companies? Like, we had a question about someone asking about the Deloitte program for would-be board members.
Oh, yeah, right. Yeah, thank you. Deloitte, KPMG also has some very good board programs. In fact, I was at a KPMG meeting in Florida last winter, coincidence. But they do some very good training, particularly for, if it's a public accounting firm, they tend to have a financial slant. So if you're on the audit committee, they can be very helpful. Yeah, those are good.
Okay. We've gotten a few questions all relating to, what if. So there's a couple of questions that have come in. What if I'm not a C-level executive? Another one about, please discuss how a successful entrepreneur with little direct public company experience might qualify for board work. Any thoughts on that? If you don't have necessarily, all the credentials.
Yep. Well, I would define C-level experience kind of broadly, but as I said in one of the slides, they're looking for demonstrated leadership, and it could be not just as the CEO, but it could be anyone who reports directly to the CEO, or it could be a division head. Might be the head of HR if that person serves as a strategic business partner to the business. If you're not at all a corporate type, and let's say maybe you run a fair-sized nonprofit, but as a result, you may bring a certain skill to that board. That could work. I think it goes back to asking the question, why should I be invited to join a board? And if you can't come up with that answer yourself, an interesting thing you might do is if you've got some trusted mentors, advisors, or perhaps old friends who have seen you in business or in your professional life, have a conversation with them, buy them breakfast, and tell them what you're thinking about. They know you, presumably, quite well. And if you can't come up with the reasons why you should be invited to join a board, they may be able to help you with that. So there is a need for diversity. We don't need all C-level people. So I guess that might be a way to do it. But, strategy number one, look yourself in the mirror. What do you bring to the board?
All right, a few more here. I hope we can squeeze in. There have been several questions that have come in around this, and I think one of your first slides might have pointed to the answer to this. But are lawyers ever welcome on corporate boards, or are they considered too risk averse?
Good question. No, not necessarily. No, not out of hand are they considered risk averse. Lawyers in law firms are generally not the most sought after for board seats, although law firm partners may serve on the board as a secretary of the board in some companies. I think that people with legal background and the training that goes with that in terms of being logical and asking questions and all that stuff are valuable. So I'm working with a client right now who is who's a lawyer by training, but he's run a business unit in an energy company, and it was his lawyer training that got him the job, but he basically worked his way up to a P&L responsibility position. So I guess the training of being a lawyer can be helpful. Just because you're a lawyer, I don't think either qualifies you or disqualifies you, but you've got to be able to answer that same question. Why should you be invited to join the board?
Okay. Does significant nonprofit board work interest corporate board recruiters?
Yeah, good question. Usually not. They'll say, not so much. You don't learn much there. I have a different view of that, however. I think that you can learn a lot in a significant nonprofit as a board director in terms of how boards make decisions, how to interact effectively with the board and with the CEO. I think you can learn a heck of a lot. So I wouldn't discount it, but your question was about whether executive recruiters counted for much. They usually don't.
Okay. Here's another one. Is it worth retaining a board search firm?
Well, you don't retain a board search firm. There are some organizations out there that claim that if you pay them money, they will help you find a board seat. I am generally very skeptical of those. Companies will hire an executive search firm to find a director for them, or they'll do it through networking. And your obligation as someone who wants to sit on a board is really to connect with the right people, the influencers or the decision makers, through your own networking activity. I don't think you can expect to be able to hire a board search firm and they're going to connect you with the opportunities.
So in other words, save your money.
Save your money.
Here's one that's right up your alley. This person's curious to know your thoughts on people with a marketing background. How often are people with this skill set of interest?
Yeah, I think a lot. It's below interest in general management and finance, but again, depending on the company, they are often wanted. I told my story at the outset about Amica, and they wanted a consumer marketing guy, And so I filled the bill on that. So I think, but I guess I conclude, I think marketing people are in demand, but marketing people who view marketing in the context of their whole enterprise, rather than I've got my marketing silo and I'm a real good guy in this silo, if that makes sense.
That makes sense. And we are right up to the wire here. So unfortunately, that was the last question. But I want to thank Mike for sharing his time and vast knowledge with us today. And thanks to all of you for joining us. Recording of this presentation will be available on our website sometime next week, and I'll be sending out an email to everyone when it's posted. You will also receive a small email survey about this webinar, and I encourage you to share your feedback with us. If you have any follow-up questions, please feel free to reach out to me here in the alumni office. Stay tuned for more career webinars in the months to come. Up next will be our November 1st webinar on managing a multi-generational workforce. More information about that webinar can be found on our website, and registration will open up on October 15th. Again, thanks for joining us and have a great afternoon.